Thank you all for joining us today for this pollinator workshop. I'm Megan Ademeyer with the Clallam Conservation District, and we are pleased to once again host Eric Lee Mader for giving a presentation to us on pollinators. I believe this is his third year now in a row coming and teaching folks in our area about pollinators and the wonderful things that they do. So Eric is the Pollinator Conservation and Agricultural Biodiversity Co-Director at the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. In this role, Eric works across the world with farmers, major food companies, and agencies such as the USDA and the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization to enhance biodiversity in agricultural lands. Since 2008, Eric and his team have supported large-scale wildflower restoration for pollinators across more than 900,000 acres around the United States. Eric's professional background includes previous work as an extension farm educator, commercial beekeeper, and crop consultant for the seed industry. He's also the author of several books, including Attracting Native Pollinators and Farming with Beneficial Insects. And we actually learned about Eric through his company Northwest Meadowscapes, which he and his wife run in the Whidbey Island, Port Townsend area. And we were able to offer pollinator seed packets through our annual native plant sale, which are packaged up at his company, Northwest Meadowscapes. And they have a wonderful website. I encourage you to check it out and all the wonderful native seeds that they sell on their website. And without further ado, we're going to go ahead and turn this over to Eric for him to share all his wonderful knowledge on pollinator species.
And yes, I am over in Port Townsend today, and it's super windy over here. I don't know how it is for the rest of the folks on the peninsula, but if my video stops or if the slideshow stops at any point, certainly do note it in the chat box, and I'll try to pause and see if I can repair the connection for us. So with that said, I am going to try to advance the slides here. Let me see. There we go. So as Megan mentioned, I am with this organization called the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation, which is a 50-year-old wildlife conservation nonprofit named after the now extinct Xerces blue butterfly, which was the first butterfly to go extinct in North America as a result of habitat loss. And our work really began initially as a dedicated butterfly conservation group, but over the decades, we've expanded our focus to work on a whole range of invertebrate conservation issues. Everything from still butterflies, but also wild bee conservation, which is primarily what I focus on, to people working on freshwater mussels, on pesticide policy issues, on endangered species. We've got a group that is working on more firefly issues in the eastern United States. I've got a program now that is doing more work around soil health and the conservation of soil organisms. So we have a really broad spectrum of work within our portfolio. And people sometimes think it's kind of strange that there's a wildlife conservation organization that's specifically focused on invertebrates. But of course, these are the animals that have this important role as pollinators, and it looks like my video may have conked out here. Okay. So picking up where I left off, there is sometimes this question of why focus on insect conservation. And of course, as we're going to talk about here over the next hour, these are the animals that, of course, pollinate plants, and something like 85 or 90% of terrestrial plant species on Earth either require or benefit from insect pollination. But these are also animals that sequester carbon by breaking down organic matter and mineralizing components into the soil. These are animals that cycle nutrients. And of course, insects are the primary food source for most songbirds on Earth and other wildlife as diverse as bears and salmon and a huge range of vertebrate animals in between. And if, in case that wasn't compelling enough as a reason to focus on insects and invertebrates, these are also the most abundant and diverse animals on Earth. Earth is truly a planet of insects and invertebrates. If you look at this graph, the tiny, tiny slice there down at about 5 o'clock that represents mammals, it should give you a sense of scale of how diverse these invertebrate species are on the planet. So along with that, my work focused on insect conservation is primarily focused on agricultural landscapes. And a lot of that work takes place nationwide in places like the Central Valley of California, where this photo is taken. And the question also sometimes comes up, why focus on agricultural lands in my work? And it's simply because agriculture is the single largest land use on the planet. And if we want to have a chance of maintaining or preserving biodiversity, we have to focus on conservation in these landscapes. A lot of that work ends up looking like this. A lot of that work is focused on essentially rewilding or reintroducing wild habitat back into those farmed landscapes. So this is a multi-thousand acre almond orchard there in the background. And my team at Xerces works to go into landscapes like this and add habitat features in and around those farm systems. Here's a blueberry farm where you can see the blueberries on the right, but this is a farm that rather than bringing in honeybees to pollinate that crop, it's entirely pollinated by the wildflower field border that we've installed adjacent to it. This field border grows its own pollinators to pollinate that adjacent crop. As I mentioned, pollinators play this keystone role in the reproduction of plant species on Earth. We can put all of these sort of clever statistics together and say that this is a service that constitutes something like 1 in every 3 mouthfuls of food or drink that we consume, and that it's a service worth billions of dollars a year. But from my perspective, that's much like trying to put a dollar value on oxygen or on clean water. We don't have a direct substitute for this service. So in essence, this is a priceless service that these animals provide to us. And when we talk about pollinators, we are, of course, talking about all of these different types of animals, everything from butterflies to certain flies to certain moths to some species of beetles and wasps. There are more exotic pollinators, clearly, in some parts of the world, like hummingbirds and bats and lemurs. But of all of these different groups of animals, bees are arguably, and easily arguably, the most important or the apex pollinators that we have. And there's a few reasons for this. One being that bees are the only insect group that by and large actively collect and transport pollen. And they do this because they're collecting pollen as a food source for their larvae. So bees undergo this dietary transition over the course of their life, where during their larval stage, they feed on a protein-based diet, and pollen is high in protein. It's anywhere from 3 to 30 or 40% protein by weight. And then as adults, they switch to a carbohydrate-based diet of flower nectar, the sugary secretion of flowers. And many animals undergo this same sort of dietary transition. The stupid joke I always use is that we do this as well as humans, where we live on a protein-based diet as infants, where we feed on breast milk or formula or that protein-rich food source that we need as babies, and then we become adults and switch to this carbohydrate-based diet of high fructose corn syrup and potato chips. So there's a lot of parallels between humans and bees that I'll try to highlight as we go through this. So that's one reason why bees are really important. They have these hairy bodies that capture pollen, and in the process of transporting that pollen back to the nest, they drop a huge amount of it along the way on different flowers. So that brings up the second reason why bees are the most important pollinators, and that's a behavior called floral constancy, which simply means that a bee visiting, say, a thimbleberry flower is going to go from thimbleberry to thimbleberry to thimbleberry in close succession in time. And that provides for cross-pollination within that same species of plant, rather than, say, a butterfly, which may visit 3 totally different plant species in succession for nectar. And finally, bees have this behavior, this place-based behavior. They have a nest that they construct, that they provision with food for their larvae, and that means that they are limited in their range. And so as humans, we take advantage of this for crop pollination. We can put a beehive in an apple orchard, and the service of pollination will radiate out some distance from that beehive. Or we can do what I do, which is to create habitat in a specific place for pollinators to nest in and live in, and then that service of pollination will radiate out from that habitat. So to set the stage here and give a sense of how pollinators are doing overall, I thought it would be good to just touch base on some of the big stories that are out there and provide a big picture overview of how bees and other pollinators and beneficial insects are doing right now. And I'm sure many of you have seen headlines like this and heard about the so-called insect apocalypse. And in many ways, this is a real situation. But to begin with, many people have heard this story told oftentimes around the honeybee, the European honeybee, and the situation with beekeeping in the United States. And to be clear, the honeybee is not native to North America. It was first imported in the early 1600s and did very well in the North American continent for centuries. But beginning in about the 1950s, we began to experience this significant ongoing steady decline of managed honeybee hives in the United States. And there's a whole range of reasons why this has happened, from poor habitat sources to the increased use of pesticides to diseases to parasites. And here you can see this varroa mite on the back of this honeybee, that brown disc there on its back, which is a parasite that not only sucks out vital fluids of that honeybee, but it also vectors viruses at the same time. And it was a parasite that was introduced several decades ago and ultimately became the most detrimental development in American beekeeping, and has made beekeeping very, very challenging. This decline in honeybees, this 50% decline in honeybees that we've experienced over the past half century, is having a real world economic impact on some sectors of US agriculture. And the most obvious case for this is in almond pollination in California. So I guess I want you to know that there are around 900,000 acres of almonds in California, and those almond orchards are stocked at a minimum rate of at least 2 honeybee hives per acre. Now, on a good day, there's 1.5 to 2 million commercial honeybee hives everywhere in the United States, which means that when the almond trees come into bloom, which they will here in about a month, almost all of the commercial honeybee hives in the United States go to California to pollinate this crop. Now, it's a questionable issue of how an industry can sustain itself with such a limited supply of essential pollinators for it. Beginning if we look back at this graph in the mid 90s, almond growers were paying an average of $35 to $40 to rent one single honeybee hive for pollination during this bloom period. And as the acreage of almonds increased exponentially in California over the years since, and as honeybee numbers have declined at the same time, this rental fee that almond growers pay for honeybees has steadily gone up. And you can see by the early 2000s, that number had just about doubled to $75 or $80 to rent one single honeybee hive. And then 2006 came along, 2007, 2008, the really catastrophic years for American beekeeping. And suddenly people were talking about this thing called colony collapse disorder. And you have beekeepers who are going out of business and beekeepers who are losing huge numbers of hives. And here's what happened to the average rental fee for one single honeybee hive. By 2008, you had some growers paying almost $200 to rent a single honeybee hive for that brief bloom period. Now, all of that said, the honeybee is not going extinct. It is at a global level doing perfectly fine. But the same is not the case with some of our wild native pollinators. And there's lots of examples of this, but two that I'll focus on are the bumblebees. We have 50-odd species of bumblebees in North America. As of today, fully a quarter of them are at risk of extinction, most likely. Several of them are probably already extinct, including some West Coast natives. Similarly, monarch butterflies, which have declined by more than 90% over the past few decades, have now crossed, particularly in the West, a pretty dire threshold. So there are two populations of monarch butterflies in North America. There's the population east of the Rocky Mountains that migrates south to Mexico every year and overwinters there. There's the western population of monarch butterflies that overwinters along the California coast and then migrates inland into the inland Pacific Northwest in the summer months to breed on milkweed, and then returns back, the next generation returns back to California to overwinter. Because monarchs overwinter, and we know where they overwinter in these groves of trees, they're very easy to count. And now the monarch butterfly, last year I thought the population had reached a catastrophic low when it came in less than 30,000 individuals. And this year we're still waiting on final numbers, but the number this year could be less than 3,000, could even be less than 2,000. I've not seen the most recent counts. But we are at a point now where scientists actively think that this could be the last year of the monarch migration in the Western United States, that this species may have entered what's called an extinction vortex, where it no longer has enough individual numbers to rebuild its population and remain a viable extant species across the landscape. So these trends mirror larger global trends in insect declines. In Europe, there's been extensive monitoring of insects going back decades in nature reserves, which by definition should preserve nature. And the scientists there have documented almost an 80% decline in insect biomass in those landscapes. And I don't mention it here in the slide deck, but there are corresponding studies now showing similar declines in songbird populations in Europe as well, demonstrating the close linkage between insects as a food source and songbirds. And of course, these trends mirror the larger trends that we see in wildlife in general. And the best tool we have for kind of quickly communicating the population status of wildlife on Earth is a project called the Living Planet Index, which is a big data modeling project of the London Zoological Society and the World Wildlife Federation that aggregates population surveys for thousands of different species of animals, surveys that go back for many, many years. And you crunch all those numbers together and you can see how things like freshwater fish or songbirds or waterfowl or reptiles and amphibians are doing. And essentially what we see is that over the past 40 years, Earth has lost around 60% of the sheer numbers of wild animals that used to roam its surface or swim in its waters. There's many reasons why these declines are taking place, including an increased use in certain classes of insecticides. One of those is the neonicotinoids, these systemic, meaning they're absorbed into plant tissue, insecticides that mimic the chemistry of nicotine. And these are sometimes sequestered in flower nectar or pollen. And these are insecticides that are highly toxic to insects and very mobile in the environment and very long-lived in the environment. And we're at a point now where more than half of all surface waters in the United States have measurable levels of these insecticides present. We've also seen continued ongoing loss of habitat, both urbanization and also to agriculture, especially in the Midwest, where there's been a conversion, a constant conversion of grassland to cropland, especially for corn and soybean production over the past few decades for livestock feed and for ethanol. So we continue to see these same trends that that conservationists have contended with for decades are still the same trends that we're seeing today and the same pressure points on wildlife that we've seen for a long time. So with all of that said, I will just take a quick pause here and try to look at the chat. I don't see any questions yet, so I'm going to keep going. And let's talk a little bit about just basic pollinator ecology. And I'm going to focus this section of the talk primarily on native bee ecology, because again, bees, especially wild bees, are essentially the apex pollinators on planet Earth. So at a global level, there are around 20,000 known species of wild bees on the planet. Within North America, we think that there are 3,500 to 4,000 species of native bees. Although these are still animals that routinely, where routinely new species are sometimes found, especially in areas that have never been sampled before for wild bee populations. Many of these wild bees are closely adapted to particular groups of native plants. Some of them are generalists and will visit many types of plants, but others are specialists in things like sunflowers or blueberries. And if you think about the many plant species that we eat that are native to the Americas, you begin to come up with a list of things like blueberries and sunflowers and pumpkins and squash and cranberries. And with almost all of those plants, there are particular bee species that emerge in time to take advantage of the flowers of those plants. Now, since we don't have time to practice learning how to identify and understand all 4,000 species of bees in North America, I want to focus on just 3 functional groups of native bees. And if you can remember that there are these 3 functional groups, you can do a tremendous amount of conservation in your own backyard, in your community garden, in your farm operation, to protect these animals. And these 3 functional groups are first and foremost bumblebees. bumblebees are the group that we think of as being truly social animals, much like honeybees are social animals, where they live in a complex family unit. There's a single queen who lays eggs, and the daughters that she produces are the workers who manage things like defending the nest and bringing back pollen and nectar resources for the nest. There are also some male bees that a bumblebee colony will typically produce that are the drones that have very little function other than freeloading on some nectar and looking for mates. So similar to the behavior of human males, perhaps. Unlike honeybees, bumblebees have an annual life cycle. So if you think about a honeybee hive, you could think about it as being parallel to a perennial plant, where in the absence of diseases or parasites or pesticide exposure, a perfectly healthy honeybee hive, in theory, could live forever by simply replacing the queen when she begins to get old and to lose her functional service to the greater family unit. Bumblebees, in contrast, are more like an annual plant where they're planted from seed every year by a single bee, by the queen bee. And these are animals that form nests, usually underground in old abandoned rodent burrows, and they're animals that are really well built for our climate. These are cold weather animals that do really, really well even in cool and rainy conditions. So if you if you wanted to think of an overview, an annual overview of what a bumblebee colony life cycle looks like, this is essentially what it looks like. And this is the type of place where you might find a bumblebee nest on your property. Again, they tend to like brushy areas and old rodent burrows and underground cavities. Right now, here we are in early January at the 12 o'clock position in this graph on the left. Right now, the only bumblebees that we have around us are the newly mated queens that have dug themselves down into the soil, and they are hibernating for the winter, much like bears hibernate. And in a few months, those queen bees are going to dig themselves out of the ground, and they are going to look for a suitable nesting site, a cavity roughly the size of a football or a basketball, and they will begin to go out and collect some pollen and nectar, and they're going to build these little wax cells or pots that they're going to put those pollen and nectar resources in. The nectar is just for the queen to maybe have a food source in case it's too cold and windy to get outside. But she'll take that pollen mass and she'll begin to lay eggs on it, and she'll cover it in wax, and then she'll sit on it and incubate it like a mother bird incubates her eggs. And people think bumblebees or insects are cold-blooded, but in fact, bumblebees are warm-blooded animals, and they can increase their body temperature to roughly the same internal temperature that we have as humans. Now, as her first generations of offspring hatch, those are her worker daughters. They're oftentimes kind of runty and small because she's been trying to provide this food for this growing family. They may not be super well fed, but those little worker daughters will then take over the duties of going out and bringing back more pollen and nectar, and the queen will simply hunker down in the nest and continue to lay eggs. Now, so that brings us to sort of the 6 o'clock position in this graph. If we move into midsummer and late summer, several things will happen. First, the colony, if it's successful in bringing back enough food, some of those offspring will become more well-fed. They'll have more fully developed reproductive systems, and those will become the next generation's queens, next year's queens. At the same time, the queen can begin laying male eggs. And there's several reasons for what triggers or what could trigger male egg laying. But bees can decide if they're going to lay a male egg or a female egg. So here late in the life cycle at this 9 o'clock position, you have some male bees being hatched. You have these newly developed or newly emerging queen bees. Those new males and new queens leave the nest. They look for mates. They have really interesting mating habits that are almost as interesting or more interesting to me than that of songbirds. But after they mate, the newly mated queen, will head off and look for that hibernation spot for herself for the winter ahead. And the male bees die, the old workers from the old colony die, the queen bee dies, everybody dies at the end of the story except those new queens, if that makes sense. So that's the story of bumblebees. Now, bumblebees are still only representative of a very small group of bee species on Earth. The more abundant and diverse groups of bees are the native solitary bees. And the majority of bee species on Earth are these wild, solitary, ground nesting individuals where every female is essentially a single mother. She doesn't live in a colony of sisters or workers. Every single ground nesting bee will excavate an underground nest. The female will provision that nest with a mass of pollen, and that's the picture on the right here. These nests can extend down several feet into the ground. They are sometimes lined with waxy glandular secretions to resist flooding. And again, these are the most abundant and diverse animals on Earth. And this is an overview of their life cycle. So here at the 12 o'clock position, you have this female bee. She, at the 3 o'clock position, has excavated this cavity in the ground. At the 6 o'clock position, you can see she's laid an egg on that orange mass of pollen, that protein-rich food source. The larva at the 7 o'clock position will feed on that, and then it will undergo complete metamorphosis there at the 9 o'clock position, and then emerge usually the following year as a new adult bee. And again, the males have no role in this. The males will emerge from these nests, they'll look for mates, and then they die a short time afterwards. This is a life cycle that is largely dependent on the success of the females. Some of the common ground nesting bees that you might see around us are things like these green metallic sweat bees or these longhorn bees there on the right, and the name for them is probably obvious from the photo. These are particularly common in the spring and the summer in our region. And then the last group of native bees that you might see are the wood nesting bees. And these represent a fairly small proportion of our wild native bees, although in our region, these are fairly well represented. These are bees that nest in old hollow stems or beetle borer holes. These are leafcutter bees and carpenter bees and mason bees. You can see leafcutter bees here in this particular slide are given their name for the fact that they chew out these round circular pieces of leaves and use those to plug off the entrances to their nest sites. And they also use those leaf pieces to actually wrap up their larvae and the pollen that their larvae feed on as little leaf enclosed packages. So the life cycle here is much like that of ground nesting bees, where on the top of this slide, you see this cross section of a hollow plant stem with pollen provisions here inserted into these hollow plant stems, carried in there by the mother bee. She lays those little white eggs on those pollen masses, and the eggs hatch and feed on the pollen. They undergo complete metamorphosis. In the case of this bee species, which is a mason bee, which gets its name from the little brick masonry or mud walls that it builds between each of these cells of eggs, those larvae will spin a silk cocoon around themselves and then pupate and undergo complete metamorphosis, and then single file in the springtime work their way out of the entrance of that nest. All right, I'm gonna just check in again here on the chat and just see if there are any comments quick that I can answer before the end. From Peter, Eric, could you comment on Paul Stamets' work with mycelium to help mitigate bee viruses? Unfortunately, Peter, I can't because I don't know anything about it, but I will certainly check that out. Moving into just one quick note here about our region. I do want to point out that we have our own cohort of highly imperiled pollinators that are species that were formerly or still found right around us. And these include particularly a number of butterflies in our region, things like the Taylor's checker spot, the Marden skipper. The island marble is a butterfly that is represented by just a few hundred individuals out on San Juan Island, and is arguably one of the most at-risk species of wildlife in North America today. And then the western bumblebee, which was the most common bumblebee in our region going back a few decades, and now is extremely uncommon in Western Washington. To go from being the most common bumblebee species in our region to now one of the least common is sort of the trajectory that it's been on. So switching gears here now, I'll focus most of the rest of the conversation here on habitat and the value of habitat. And we know from a really large and robust body of scientific research over the past 2 decades that there's a clear trend that we see in agriculture, and this applies to gardens as well. And that trend is that when there is enough habitat present, wild pollinators can provide the full spectrum of pollination services we need to pollinate plants that we depend upon. So in the Central Valley of California, where I do a lot of work, there's huge expanses of the farm landscape that have no natural habitat present, like those almond orchards. And those are landscapes that are entirely dependent on managed honeybees being imported into them to pollinate these crops. Yet, if you go to the edge of the Central Valley to where there's some nearby mountains or foothills or shrubby riparian areas or hedgerows, those farms that have 30% or more of the nearby area in some type of natural habitat can get all of their pollination needs met by the habitat alone, by the wild bees that are supported by that habitat. We see the same trend looking at other large-scale agricultural systems like canola in the prairie provinces of Canada, where the growers there actually have higher yields and are more profitable if they leave some of their land out of production to support the pollinators, the wild pollinators of those canola crops. This is counterintuitive, but to illustrate it here on the left, you have this fence row to fence row model of canola production. Based upon this research, this field on the left, which has more overall acreage of canola planted, is actually producing less yield, less harvestable seed, and therefore is less profitable than this model on the right that maintains some wild habitats for pollinators to survive in. Beyond bees, we see that this habitat also supports other beneficial insects. It supports ground beetles, many of which are seed feeding specialists. And among those seed feeding specialists, many of them preferentially feed on weeds, things like crabgrass or or pigweed or foxtail. And these ground beetles are actually in many places performing an enormous but under-recognized role in cropland weed suppression. Habitat areas are also supporting things like dung beetles that are cycling nutrients and reducing methane emissions. And we know that at a global level, dung beetles actually have a significant role in helping to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions from livestock operations. But again, these are animals that are dependent upon nearby natural habitat. Outside of insects, we know that things like songbirds contribute to pest suppression, and where there is sufficient habitat, like roosting trees or hedgerows or areas for them to nest in, that songbirds can have a significant role in the suppression of some crop pests as well. And we know that, again, these services are translating to real-world economic values, real-world dollars and returns on investment for farmers. One of our colleagues, Rufus Isaacs at Michigan State University, did some work around this with his grad students about a decade ago, and was ultimately able to tease out that blueberry growers there in Michigan who planted wildflower field borders next to their blueberries were seeing double-digit yield increases in those crops. And of course, it costs money to put in a wildflower field border, but based upon their measurements, they were able to see a return on that investment in just 3 to 4 years. Beneficial insects that use these habitat areas are also feeding on pest insects and supporting the natural pest suppression that takes place where there's a diverse range of organisms in an agricultural ecosystem. And this service we know is one that is worth billions of dollars a year. But we also know, and intuitively, all of you know this, that to make this, to actualize this service, this beneficial insect suppression of pests, we need to have areas in the landscape for those beneficial insects to nest in, to lay eggs in, to overwinter in, to have food sources beyond just a single thing. If you've got a monoculture of anything, whether it's almonds or corn, we all intuitively know that the only animals that can exist in a monoculture of corn are the animals that feed on corn. These other beneficial insects, whether they're assassin bugs or predatory wasps or lady beetles, they need these more diverse habitats to sustain themselves in. And I just want to point out that none of this is new or novel thinking. This is farming the way people once knew how to farm. And our U.S. Department of Agriculture used to produce publications on this, like make this publication, Making Land Produce Useful Wildlife. The Massachusetts Department of Agriculture at one time published this huge book. I've got a copy of it about useful birds and their protection, which had these sections about how birds save trees and crops from damage by suppressing pest insect populations. In the Second World War, this concept was one that was tied to a sense of patriotism, where we knew that birds protected crops and it was your patriotic duty to feed the birds in the wintertime. This is a magazine advertisement from the 1940s, sponsored by an ammunition company. Even the U.S. Department of Agriculture at one point recognized that wild bees were playing this very important role in crop pollination. Here you can see this fact sheet that they produced. Wild bees are good pollinators. Who would have thought that, huh? And they produced this fact sheet with the all of these habitat areas highlighted in it, things like field borders and hedges and these odd areas of the farm that were worth something and worth protecting and worth conserving for this value that pollinators provide. And even skunks at one point in time were recognized for their role in supporting us. Here's some quotes from this fine publication. The skunk has now become a recognized asset in the community and it inhabits. The skunk conserves the food supply by preying upon insects and other pests of crops. So taking all of the things that I've talked about so far, at Xerces and through my work, we take that information and we apply it through both a biological lens, but also this historical lens. And I'm constantly looking back at older models for how to do this. And one of the interesting jumping off points for this has, for me, been this old book called Farmers of 40 Centuries, published by Frank Hiram King in 1911. Frank was a soil scientist. He was also the inventor of the grain silo. He was also just a designer he was an expert in songbirds, a very interesting man. He was a designer of rural schoolhouses, and it's thought that some of his early designs were ones that went on to influence Frank Lloyd Wright, who lived nearby him. But in the last couple of years of his life, Frank King traveled to Asia to try to understand why in places in China and Korea and Japan had been able to successfully farm the same agricultural lands, the same plot of land for many, many centuries with no loss in productivity. And thinking about this sense of longevity, there's a lot of different threads that we can follow. And one of those threads is a model for food production that's very close to home for us in the Northwest, which is the tradition of Camas meadow management by indigenous people. For those of you who don't know Camas, it's this wildflower with this edible bulb. There's this saying, which I believe, this native First Nation saying that the more you dig it, the better it does. And that's true, because as you dig this plant, you are constantly breaking off little sections of the root and regrowing more plants. And eventually you end up with things like this photo here in the upper right-hand corner, which are meadows of this edible bulb. And native people learned that they could burn clearings in the forested landscape, that they could dig these bulbs, and the Camas responded with more and more and more food sources. It exponentially increased the availability of this very important food source. And most of these meadows are gone today because these were the first areas settled by white settlers when they moved into the Northwest. And yet, if I want to go back and find things like the Taylor's checker spot butterfly, the Marden skipper, if I want to find rare songbirds in our region like the western meadowlark or the vesper sparrow, these are the same places I go to look. So here you have this system that is not only producing food for centuries, but also supporting biological diversity at the same time. There's another thread you can follow, which is the example of hedgerows in Western Europe. Hedgerows are this model of agriculture that goes back to Bronze Age times, where you had early farmers in places like what is now Normandy, who would be out cultivating their little plot of land. They'd dig up a rock, they'd throw that rock off in the distance, and eventually their little plots of land ended up by being ringed by the rocks that they dug up. And then shrubs and brambles would grow up in those rock piles, and biomass would accumulate. And eventually these became these impenetrable thickets that surrounded the agricultural lands. And then the farmers learned that no longer did they need to chase down wild animals. They could use these as living thorny fences to contain livestock as well. And the accounts of these hedgerows are so old that you can trace them back to even Caesar's time, when during the Gallic Wars, he wrote about encountering these hedgerows in what is now probably northern France or southern Belgium, where he was confounded by the fact that his armies couldn't penetrate the thorny brambles and shrubs that made up these hedges, and that they performed these impenetrable walls that inhibited movement during the Gallic Wars. And you can go to Western Europe today, and the biomass that's accumulated in these hedges has added many, many feet of height to the hedges. And Normandy is among the most famous landscapes for these hedges. And Normandy, of course, was also the scene of these really horrific battles after D-Day during the Second World War. And hedges feature still commonly in the narratives around the early battle for Normandy. And there's even film footage of these hedge battles where in some cases you had German soldiers on one side of a hedge and Allied soldiers on the other side, and they could even talk to each other through these hedges, but they were so thick and impenetrable that neither side could make significant headway. It wasn't until the US Army had learned to mount essentially saws on the front of tanks to cut through these hedges that the battle began to move forward. So these hedges went through essentially apocalyptic conditions, and yet you go to them today, and these are still the lands that, these are still the features in the landscape where you find the songbirds and the foxes and the hedgehogs and the rare butterflies. So there's definitely a linkage between the value of that habitat in those landscapes in supporting both agriculture and supporting biological diversity. And the last example here is just this model of Satoyama in Japan. And I went to college in Japan and lived in a Satoyama landscape. Satoyama is this common way of speaking about certain types of rural landscapes that have a mix of agriculture and forest land. And they truly epitomize this symbiosis between humans and nature. The forests in Satoyama are all actively managed. There's constant pruning and thinning that goes on in these forests to harvest wood for firewood, for charcoal production, for incense. And with all that constant thinning, there's a lot of light penetration into the understory of these forests, and consequently a huge amount of biological diversity, a huge diversity of plant species that grow in the understories of these managed forests. And in parts of Japan where people are leaving the countryside and moving to the city and creating these rural ghost towns, the forests are becoming thicker and darker, and a lot of that plant diversity is being lost. Similarly, even the rice paddies in these Satoyama systems are functioning as the spawning grounds for certain freshwater fish. They're the primary source of food for things like turtles that are moving into the rice paddies when they're flooded and feeding on slugs, which are a pest of the rice plants. And it's a system that has evolved so slowly and at such a low impact over many, many centuries that it is one that supports both human food production and biological diversity at the same time. So a lot of my work is related to understanding how we can apply these principles to modern settings, taking the notion that water runs downhill and applying it to the human created landscape that we live in today. So we'll pause here again, and if there are really any really long questions, I'm probably going to wait till the end. Oh boy, there's a lot of questions in here. Pat asks, why are we losing bees and butterflies, especially in our region? Again, Pat, this goes back to the issue of habitat loss, of pesticide use, of introduced diseases and parasites. Terry asks, I would like to suppress grass in my wildflower meadow. Can you comment on the use of yellow rattle? Terry, I'll come back to that. And then Jennifer is asking about agroforestry and its effects on pollinators and birds. And she says that she was thinking about traditional forest and meadow care in regards to indigenous farming. It's still farming, just not monoculture. I would agree with that, Jennifer. And how do you engage indigenous people in regards to insect conservation? That's probably a conversation worth having in and of itself, rather than kind of briefly touching on it here, Jennifer. I appreciate you asking it, and I think a lot of us involved in conservation are really interested in how we can understand the goals and traditions and philosophy of indigenous people, and using that as a guide and trying to amplify that, as opposed to necessarily translating our approach to an indigenous people's setting, if that makes sense. And then there's a comment coming up here on home gardeners. I'll leave those for now, that and the yellow rattle here, and maybe come back to those as we talk a little bit more about actual habitat restoration for those for these animals. So taking this concept of farmers of 40 centuries, our goal, our collective goal, should be really to create these resilient landscapes all around us, in the home garden, in the farm, in our cities, in our parks and urban green spaces. And the clues to do this are all around us. This is a photo by my colleague Stephanie Frischi, who worked in olive production in Spain. And Stephanie recognized that olives historically are plants of scrubby savannas. So why are we growing olives as we typically do on the left in these moonscape environments? Why not plant the native understory that should normally be growing underneath all olive trees? So if we think about this, if we think about the idea of native vegetation, the indigenous vegetation of a place, if we think about this template of hedgerows that have been so successful in Europe, why not apply that to something like a 2,000 or 3,000 acre almond farm in California? Why not take these fence lines here, like on the left, that are just disused areas, and why not plant them with these long, linear, flowering, drought-tolerant trees and shrubs, and let them grow up over the centuries and become those wildlife corridors of that landscape? Collaboratively working with the University of Berkeley over about a 9-year period, we put a lot of effort into doing exactly this. And with partners at UC Berkeley, we began to tease out the direct measurable benefits of these hedgerows. And I promise this is one of, or probably the most boring graph of the entire presentation. But what it essentially shows is that these hedgerows are exporting beneficial insects to adjacent crops. So you can raise pest insects in a laboratory, get them to lay eggs. You can take those egg masses and go out and put them out into the middle of a crop field, or at intervals of distance from the edge of a crop field, say 100 or 200 or 300 meters out into the middle of the crop field, and then go back and see how many of those egg masses were attacked by beneficial tiny wasp species. And what we see is that on the farms that have these hedgerows surrounding them, more of those pest egg masses are attacked by the beneficial insects than on farms that don't have hedgerows surrounding them. And of course, people want to know, well, that's all well and good, but is this also then attracting pests are these hedgerows also attracting more pests in addition to the beneficial insects? And it turns out that not so much. If you survey insect populations in and around these hedgerows in California, if you go out into the crop field near the hedgerow, you typically find fewer aphids and flea beetles and lygus bugs, these pest insects, adjacent to those hedgerows than you find on farms that don't have those hedgerows around them, that maybe just have some weedy, non-native, scraggly vegetation around those farms. Those weedy areas and the lack of habitat are a clear recipe for more pest populations. And this hedgerow model is also one that we think a lot about in terms of climate change and climate mitigation. So this is my team in California a few years ago. That is literally the Paradise Fire outside of Chico, California, raging in the background, and my team there planting a hedgerow in the foreground, with the fire actively taking place in this almond orchard on the left. And even you think back to my comments about World War II and the hedgerows in Europe. Here we are within just a day of these trees and shrubs being transplanted into this new hedgerow. Here you can see this California redbud bush, where already one of those leaf cutter bees has gone in and started to harvest leaf pieces out of this, meaning it's nesting nearby. Immediately, even with this fire raging several miles away, the wildlife is already responding to this hedgerow and already putting it to use. And then a year later, these plants are starting to mature, and within 2 or 3 years, California has a marvelous growing season. These things will be 6 or 8 feet in height. And we're applying this at a really large scale. So here you can see an almond orchard with a drainage ditch in the middle of it. All those little dots, those little green dots on either side of the drainage ditch running parallel to it are brand new, newly installed trees and shrubs that will form this massive two-sided hedgerow cutting through the middle of this almond orchard. And we're really interested in how we utilize this to create climate corridors and migration corridors for animals. So I mentioned the decline of monarch butterflies and how we may see now the end of the monarch migration in the Western US. We're working to try to create more places for those animals to move across the landscape. Here you can see in the upper right-hand side, the Sacramento River, that thick blue line. And here you've got this thin blue line on the left, which is an old tributary to the Sacramento River. If I take that away again, you can see that there are areas, particularly right here, where that tributary has been cut off and drained and converted back to agricultural land. And it just so happened that we had contacts with the farmers there, and this is the land that those farmers manage. This is a processing tomato field with literally no natural habitat present. And we were really interested, and we were able to work with them to use this hedgerow model to begin to reconnect that natural green space and connect back up a corridor for wildlife to move through and pollinators to move through that will ultimately connect back up to the Sacramento River. So here's a newly planted hedgerow there in the lower left-hand side, and a couple of seasons here of its growth. And again, California, these plants respond really, really well once you get them in the ground, and they'll grow really, really rapidly. But we've applied this to Central Washington, creating hedgerows in apple orchards and pear orchards, using embankments around irrigation reservoirs. And in places where hedgerows, where woody plants don't normally occur, like the northern plains of Montana, rather than hedges, we're planting prairie strips on, in this case, this organic grain farm that provide all of these multiple functions and benefits to the farm using these native plants that ultimately will also support pollinators. You can use this concept of prairie strips or meadow strips in small vegetable operations as well, like this example in Minnesota. And we even use native wildflowers as cover crops in more and more crop systems. And here's an orchard in California with the native baby blue eyes and California poppy as an annual cover crop that now reseeds itself within that orchard. We work with vineyards. There's a vineyard in Lisle, Washington on the Columbia River that planted this native understory meadow of balsam root and lupins and native grasses in and amongst their grapevines. It's an incredible farm system. It's fenced in from deer, and then in the fall they open up the gates and let the deer come in and graze down the fallen fruit and graze down the vegetation, and they're able to keep grape diseases at bay that way. Here's another example of a habitat feature. This is called a beetle bank. This is an elevated berm of these bunch grasses to support predatory beetles that are nocturnal. They come out of these bunchy grasses in the nighttime and travel throughout the leafy greens, eating slugs, and then hunker back down in this thick grassy vegetation during the daytime. And I mentioned this farm at the outset. This is a farm that is one with this wildflower field border that provides all of the pollinators, the wild pollinators that supports that adjacent crop. There's an example in California, wildflower strip that took this barren landscape next to the almond orchard, an area that had been repeatedly sprayed for weeds over decades and looks like the surface of Mars, and replanted it with these native California wildflowers. We do this in dairy farms, incorporating wildflowers back into pastures. There are folks working in the Great Plains who are using cattle to mimic the grazing patterns of bison and help maintain prairie diversity. This is another crazy example. This is actually my farm where we use the native Pacific crabapple as a rootstock in our apple orchard. So these are all brand new Pacific crabapple rootstocks that then get top grafted. So essentially everything below ground becomes native vegetation. And you can apply these same concepts at the home garden scale. You can mix native and non-native plants to create a beautiful effect in your front yard that doesn't require mowing, that can support a huge amount of pollinator activity. You can incorporate native plants into functional green spaces like bioswales. This is showy milkweed in a bioswale in Portland, Oregon. And a little feature, you can see how urbanized it is around it. This little feature not only cleans and helps improve the water quality going into the storm sewer, but it also provides pollen and nectar resources for animals. We've got land trusts who are using their land holdings as essentially pollinator preserves. Portland International Airport has taken one area in the flight path of one of their runways that needs to be maintained as open, sunny habitat without trees, and converted that back to a 50-acre native wildflower meadow. So there's a lot of examples out there on how to do this. I'm going to pause again here and look at the chat for questions. And Megan, I'm going to keep going here for a few more minutes, but I've been answering questions throughout. So I will still try to wrap up and set aside some time for you to wrap us up as well.
That sounds great, Eric. And we did lose a little bit of time at the beginning, so if it does go a few minutes over, we will be emailing the recorded version out to anyone. So even the folks who are listening today, if you missed something, we'll email that out to you as well. So I think you could just proceed on, Eric, and don't feel rushed or anything.
Okay, great. Thank you. So a lot of comments here in the chat box on on beetle banks and slugs and beneficial insects to suppress slugs. I will just say, related to this, even in my own yard over here in Port Townsend, I've got little ones who tend to leave toys out in the yard all the time. Yes, I have one of those yards. It's interesting to go out and look in the morning sometimes at random toys and things that get scattered and left overnight, because it's very common for me to find predatory beetles that get trapped in toys or cups or cans that get left outside. So we live in a landscape with a lot of these predatory beetles that are out there constantly feeding on slugs. And I know everybody here in the region who gardens has slug problems, and these predatory beetles are really dependent on brushy, grassy meadow habitat to sustain their populations. And then a question here about the pollinator habitat sign. Yeah, at Xerces.org, in the lower right-hand corner there, you can see the domain name. You can check us out and find a pollinator habitat sign for your yard. All right, so just to wrap up here, I'll try to finish with a overview, kind of a quick overview of some habitat restoration ideas and some concepts. So when you're doing restoration for pollinators or wildlife, you're typically either forced or able to choose between using transplants on the one hand or using seed on the other. And there are pros and cons to both. For woody plants and things like trees and shrubs, transplants are almost always the way to go, and they establish faster, they require a little bit less care. For wildflower meadows and native grasses, seed is usually more economical as a way to start big areas of grassy, flowery vegetation, rather than buying many individual plants and trying to put them together in a dense enough configuration to make it look like something. And seeding also requires more work in terms of site preparation. So just to touch on a few of these highlights, if you are using transplants, it's important, especially in our climate, a Mediterranean climate, to think about irrigation and to make sure, if you're getting those woody plants from the conservation district at the plant sale, make sure you water those the first year, especially in the summertime when it dries out a lot. That will really help kind of kick them off and get them growing through the first season. Most of the time, native trees and shrubs, after a few seasons of some supplemental irrigation, they're off and running on their own, and they don't need any further watering support. If you're using woody transplants, if you're creating things like hedgerows, it's sometimes useful to think about alternating species to provide for some structural diversity. And if you're like me and you live in the path of marauding deer all the time, it's important to think about how you protect those plants through fencing or plant guards. If you're using transplants to create something like hedgerows, some of the management challenges that you might see come up over the years will be the encroachment of invasive species, especially blackberry. So the more you can weed proactively, the less you will have to do reactively later on. In hedges, sometimes you see gaps, and you can note those, and if you're constantly plugging in new plants into any gaps that show up, you're creating less spaces for those invasive species to show up. Please note that some of the plant species in our region, things like snowberry and Nootka rose, which are amazing pollinator plants, are also prone to suckering. So it's good to have in mind that you might need to cut those back or brush hog them periodically. Sometimes things that you think might or should technically be a shrub will happily grow into a tree. Some of my native willows on my farm that all the textbooks say should reach a maximum height of 15 feet are now about 40 or 50 feet in height. So pruning ahead and being proactive and managing for height and spacing are really useful to keep in mind. I won't say much about this, but you can take these transplants and you can plant them out even among vegetable crops in your vegetable garden. You can run irrigation lines next to them and make maintenance really easy. They look kind of funny that way, but they serve this really interesting value to the adjacent vegetable plants that you might be growing. So I just called that out as an interesting example. For direct seeding, for things like wildflowers and native grasses, it's really, really important that you do thorough site preparation and have a site that's free of debris and free of weeds. And oftentimes you might be seeding a site with say you were seeding an acre of pasture, of former pasture that had been cleared for replanting. You might have 8 or 10 pounds of wildflower seed to scatter over that pasture for that acre. But in the soil, especially in old fields around here, you may have 200 or 300 pounds of dormant weed seed waiting to germinate. So long-term repeated site preparation is really, really valuable to create a clean slate. We frequently do site preparation with things like solarization, which is the use of this clear greenhouse plastic that's laid down over the ground. The edges are buried and the sun heats the soil surface below, not only killing any weed seedlings, but killing weed seeds down to a depth of several inches into the ground. This is really successful as a method, even in cooler, grayer, rainy climates. This works fairly well. Chemical fallowing is another way that we sometimes prep an area for replanting, meaning we do repeated herbicide treatments to a site. Sheet mulching is a non-chemical alternative where you're laying down something like cardboard and then putting straw or mulch over it to kill weeds. So those are some of the common ways that we prepare an area to produce results like this. Just to walk you through the solarization concept, here's a farm in Oregon. You can see it's not a sunny climate there. It's much like our climate here. We've tilled the area of this field to create a planting bed. We've laid down plastic over that planting bed. Going back, we bury the edges to create an airtight seal. We remove the plastic in the fall of the same year and directly scatter seed right over the top of it. And here we are 1 year later, already the wildflowers are coming up in May of the second year. In July of the second year, the wildflowers are off and running. So it takes a full year to do this, but it works fairly well. And we've made this work even on large sites with huge sheets of plastic that require multiple people to move it. The stuff gets really heavy and really dirty. The area on the left where they're pulling the plastic away from is the area that's been solarized. And on this farm in Wisconsin, they actually just flip that plastic over like a pancake. And they do that across this whole field to repeatedly solarize new areas year after year. And ultimately, this whole field then becomes a wildflower prairie. And there's the whole family out there with their buckets of seed scattering it on the ground. And again, you want to bury the edges to create an airtight seal. Don't break your back, and use simple and smart tools to make the job easier. An alternative to this is the use of silage tarps, black plastic silage tarps. This can require more time than solarization, but especially if you have a region with very, very few solar units, this, although it takes longer, can produce as good or better results. And I do a lot of this on my own farm as well, using silage tarps for site preparation. I'll just mention my company, Northwest Meadowscapes, one word, Northwest spelled out, meadowscapes.com. We sell native wildflower seed, whether you were getting seed from my family or another vendor. You typically want to be planting meadow mixes or wildflower mixes for pollinators at a rate of 40 to 60 seeds per square foot. And a good seed vendor should tell you how many seeds there are in a mix per square foot, rather than just giving you a weight and not knowing what that weight represents in actual seed count. Because seed is diverse, it comes in a lot of different sizes, and you want to, 10 pounds of seed might sound great unless it's all lupin seed, which is very large, and then you're not actually ending up with very many seeds in that mix. Diversity is useful rather than trying to micromanage which plants should be in a seed mix. Oftentimes, just having a lot of diversity is really useful, because sometimes things that you think will do well in your site actually won't. And so having a mix of 20 species is going to give you a greater insurance policy than a mix of 10 species. Grasses, even though they're not showy, native grasses, things like Romer's fescue or tufted hairgrass, these are really valuable because they help crowd out non-native grasses. Annuals are useful to have in a mix because they provide immediate gratification and first-year flowers, whereas the perennials oftentimes take longer to get going. For most folks, I'll focus here on this first part, the hand seeding part. For anything less than 5 acres, which is what probably most of the folks on this call would be dealing with, you can easily seed that by hand, by basically scattering the seed like chicken feed. You can use these broadcast seeders, drill seeders, drop seeders, and for really large areas, those can be useful. But for hand seeding, you'll be sometimes shocked by how little seed volume a mix might consist of. And again, that's a factor of sometimes the seed of wildflowers is incredibly small, and the seed of some species, it's almost like grains of sand, it's so small. So in order to plant it effectively, especially by hand, you want to increase its volume and make it easier to scatter. And the way you do that is you mix it with an inert ingredient like sand or vermiculite or peat moss. I use a grass-based cat litter a lot to bulk up the volume of seed. And then you suddenly have this very, very large, huge volume of seed that you can divide into separate buckets. And then you can scatter it across the site. And it's best to do it in separate batches, walking in opposite directions, so that you get an overlap of how the seed is scattered across the site. And that helps ensure a really good, really even coverage. And then just finally, some things to think about in terms of the management of grassy or flowery areas. You'll oftentimes want to mow these areas annually to reduce woody plant invasion. You'll want to be proactive about weeding out problematic weeds like Canada thistle or bindweed. Sometimes the diversity will decline over the years, and you may want to overseed meadows or flowering areas. And it's also worth knowing that you can look at a site and maybe say, this is too far gone. The weeds have crept back in. It's been kind of hard to manage. And maybe know when to say when, and don't feel bad about the fact that you may want to go back in and restart it or replant it. So last bit here, just plant selection for pollinators. Pollinators, of course, because they're active throughout our growing season, these are animals that need flowering plants from spring to summer to fall. So things that will be blooming soon include some of our native willows and big leaf maple. And then in the spring, we'll get into our beautiful lupins and Oregon sunshine and balsam root. But then in the fall, we've got things like our gumweed and our goldenrods and asters. Don't feel like you need to write down all these names. I'll give you a resource here to get some plant names here in a moment. But again, hearkening back to the concept of farmers of 40 centuries, we have a model for this. We have these native Camas wildflower models that serve as a template for creating pollinator habitat. Pollinators need these open, sunny habitats. They are not insects of dense, dark Doug fir forests. They need these sunny areas. And so looking back to these indigenous traditions can be really instructive and really inform successful land management. And again, here's some plant species: gumweeds, lupins, camas, springbank clover, self-heal, Douglas aster, meadowfoam, goldenrod. We've got an incredible diversity of wildflowers that are native to our region, even if we don't always recognize it because it is so forested around here. There are also these flowering plants for hedgerows or standalone shrubs, many of which are probably still available at the plant sale. Our wild roses and snowberries, our salmon berries. These are fantastic pollinator plants. And I won't say much about this, but just note that things like blackberry, you'll see bees on those, but if you look at them, they're typically honeybees and a few generalist bumblebees. These invasive plants, even though they sometimes seem like they're humming with pollinators, oftentimes you don't necessarily get a huge diversity of pollinators on them. So to wrap up here, I would just direct all of you to Xerces.org. Everything that I've talked about in this talk is available in some kind of free fact sheet or wildflower installation guide at Xerces.org. You could spend hours looking at the free resources available on the website. We've got things like a pollinator habitat assessment guide to help you identify what nesting features and foraging features might be present in your landscape, and to then be able to prioritize where you want to make investments in improving pollinator habitat. We've got guides to installing wildflower meadows, and more in-depth books on the life cycle of things like bees and beneficial insects. And also, I should say that we have a Pacific Northwest plant list or plant fact sheet available on the website as well that lists all of those plant species that I talked about. So if I gave the habitat installation section kind of a quick brush over, it's because all that information is out there for free on our website, and I'd rather you guys take the time to find exactly what you need for yourselves. That's what I've got. Let's see. I'll look at the chat quick here, Megan, and then turn it back over to you.
That sounds great. And while you answer some questions, Eric, I might go ahead and pop up my little slide that I have here, if that's all right with you.
That would be great. Yeah.
Great.
So,
thank you.
Okay. So question: time of year and duration for solarization. And oops, I got to pull up the chat again. Let's see.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did it get rid of your chat?
Yeah, I'm sure I can find it again though.
Okay. I'm sorry about that.
I've got it. No problem. So time of year and duration for solarization. So typically plastic should go down before the summer equinox. So you want to do it as the days are getting longer. So May is a good time to get it down, and then you want to remove it actually before it gets too cold out, because once it gets too cold out, the plastic will then serve as a greenhouse and you'll get rhizomes of nearby grasses and plants sending up shoots underneath it. So taking it off in September or early October is a good idea. From James, are the grasses referenced on Xerces? Yeah, James, they probably are, but those might be harder to find. If you want to check out my seed business, Northwest Meadowscapes, not that I'm encouraging you to buy anything, but we do have descriptions of some of the native grasses that are local to the Olympic Peninsula, and you could read more about sort of the growth habit and appearance and life cycle of those species. And one last question. A couple last questions here from Laura. Are you concerned with killing underground organisms with solarization? It's a good question, Laura. You know, typically the scale of impact of solarization is so small in terms of its footprint, its physical footprint, that soils can be recolonized really rapidly by organisms from adjacent areas. Also, a lot of microorganisms are living at depths or can move a little bit in depth to avoid some of the heat. But I would also say that there are questions about soil, like the symbiotic relationships between soil microbes and plants that aren't always favorable to native plants. And so places that are overrun with weedy vegetation oftentimes it's thought have soil microbial communities that are living symbiotically with those invasive plants or those weedy plants. So resetting the soil biology a little bit could actually have a role in increasing the success of native plants in a solarization setting. Deer-resistant wildflower mix from Joni. I would just say, Joni, things like lupins, gumweed. Lupins and gumweeds are probably the easy ones that deer will mostly avoid. Camas, they will eat the flowers off the tops, but the bulbs are strong enough that the plants will usually bounce back and be pretty successful. From Terry, yellow rattle. So yellow rattle is a parasitic plant, Rhinanthus minor, that is native to our region. And in Europe, it is used in meadow restoration because it parasitizes grasses, it weakens grasses, and makes for more wildflower-rich meadows. I think the jury's still out. We've been planting a lot of yellow rattle ourselves, trying to understand how successful it might be, but just anecdotally, based on our observations, it's something we're really impressed by and something we're trying to increase the propagation of. And finally, from Pat, website again, xerces.org, xerces.org will take you to all of those great informational resources. All right. Is there anything else?
And
Megan, I think it's over to you.
Okay, perfect. And if anybody has any more questions, feel free to type them in really quick while I wrap this up. Thank you so much, Eric. That was absolutely excellent as always. So much to learn and such great information also on the Xerces website. So hopefully everybody can visit that. And I did just want to quickly touch on the information that you can find on our website, Clallam Conservation District. Our website is www.clallamcd.org. And we are having a webinar tomorrow on planting and maintaining a native landscape. So we'll touch on a lot of the native shrubs and trees, both conifer and deciduous, that are in our area and excellent for pollinator habitat as well. You can go onto our website to register for that. And you can also find more information about our annual native plant sale. I know Eric mentioned it briefly, but we do have a native plant sale where we sell conifers, deciduous trees, and also shrubs. We have about 26 different species. There are a few that have sold out, and we are accepting orders through January 28th of this year. And then the plants will be available for pickup at the end of February. We also have pollinator seed packets available. We did just sell out of them, but we're trying to work with Eric to get more seed packets from his company, Northwest Meadowscapes. They have a wonderful website as well, so I encourage you to look at his website if you're interested in larger orders of native seed. And then we also have a great webpage on native plants where you can find some publications and tips on utilizing native plants in your landscape. So that is all I have. And it looks like, Eric, that there's no other questions other than just a lot of thank yous and excellent job. So again, thank you, Eric, so much for this presentation today. And to everyone that is here, we will email you out the recorded versions. So in case you missed something, you can always go back and view that. Thanks again, everyone.
Great. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Eric. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.